When Aaliyah Parker, a disabled black teenager, attends a local festival, her day takes a shocking turn after a wrongful encounter with the police. What starts as humiliation in front of her community sparks a movement for justice. As tensions rise, Aaliyah's voice becomes a powerful force for change. But can one person really stand against a system? Follow Aaliyah's gripping journey of courage, unity, and resistance. Will justice prevail? Comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for the next chapter in this fight for equality. It was one of those perfect summer afternoons where the warmth of the sun was neither too heavy nor too faint. A gentle breeze kissed the tops of the trees that lined Riverdale Park, ruffling the leaves just enough to add a soft rustling to the symphony of the festival. Everywhere Aaliyah Parker looked, there was life. Children raced through the open spaces, their laughter carrying through the air, while parents gathered at picnic tables, chatting and enjoying the variety of food on offer. The vibrant atmosphere of the festival was contagious, like the entire town had gathered for a shared celebration of togetherness and joy. Aaliyah breathed in deeply, letting the sweet scent of barbecued ribs, funnel cakes, and fresh lemonade fill her senses. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The decorations on her wheelchair, colorful ribbons and flowers, her friends had lovingly adorned it with fluttered in the breeze, a visual reflection of her lively spirit. Despite the physical challenges she faced every day, this moment felt like freedom. Her small group of friends, mostly from her high school, were gathered around her. Rachel, her best friend since childhood, handed her a fresh lemonade with a grin, her fiery red curls bouncing as she laughed at something one of the others had said. The rest of the group, Jessica, Nate, and Kyle Weir, all in high spirits, teasing each other about the various games and contests happening around the festival. Aaliyah smiled, sipping the cool drink and letting herself get lost in their playful banter. "All right, Aaliyah, your turn next," Rachel declared, pointing toward a booth where people were playing a ring toss game. The booth was covered in colorful lights, flashing in rhythm to the upbeat music playing nearby. "You're the only one who hasn't won anything yet, and we need to complete our prize collection." Aaliyah laughed. "You know, I've never been good at those things," she replied, shaking her head. "But if you really want to lose some money, I'm game." Rachel winked. "That's the spirit." As they made their way toward the booth, the sense of community surrounded them, cocooning Aaliyah in a warmth she rarely found outside of moments like these. She had grown up in this town. Riverdale wasn't perfect, but it was her home. The annual festival had always been a safe haven, a place where differences melted away and people came together in celebration. It was the kind of environment where Aaliyah felt accepted, despite the challenges she faced being both black and disabled. Her wheelchair, once a symbol of her struggle, had been transformed into a colorful celebration of her resilience. The crowd parted for her and her friends as they approached the game booth, where a family with young children was already playing. The booth operator, a tall man with a toothy grin, welcomed them warmly, handing over a basket of rings for them to toss. "You got this, Aaliyah," Rachel cheered, standing behind her with her phone ready to capture the moment. Aaliyah lined up her shot, aiming carefully before letting the ring fly. It bounced off one of the bottles and landed just shy of the target. Her friends groaned playfully, but Aaliyah just shrugged and laughed, the lightness of the moment washing over her. As the laughter died down, something shifted. A hush seemed to ripple through the crowd nearby. At first, Aaliyah didn't notice, too wrapped up in the game and the sound of her friends' voices. But as the seconds passed, the air around them seemed to grow tense, like a sudden drop in pressure before a storm. That's when she saw him. Officer Jacob Blake patrolled the edge of the festival, his eyes scanning the crowd with a look of barely concealed disdain. He was a large man, his shoulders squared and his uniform pressed with rigid precision. He wore his authority like a badge of power rather than responsibility, and his presence had a way of making people uneasy. Aaliyah had seen him before, everyone in Riverdale had. He had a reputation for being aggressive, particularly toward people of color, and it was no secret that many in the black community feared encounters with him. Aaliyah's pulse quickened slightly as she watched him make his way through the crowd, his eyes constantly shifting, looking for something or someone to focus on. She turned her attention back to her friends, trying to shake off the unease. "I'm going to give it another shot," Aaliyah said, trying to focus on the game. She picked up another ring, but her hands trembled just slightly. Before she could throw, a voice broke through the sounds of the festival. "What are you doing here?" The words were sharp, cutting through the laughter and music like a cold wind. Aaliyah froze, her heart dropping. She knew that voice. Slowly, she turned to see Officer Blake standing just a few feet away, his eyes fixed on her. His expression was hard, his jaw clenched as he looked her up and down, sizing her up like she was some sort of threat. Aaliyah blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "I'm just playing a game," she said, her voice steady, though her pulse raced. Blake took a step closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice low but filled with accusation. "This isn't your neighborhood." The words hit her like a slap to the face. Aaliyah felt the eyes of the crowd slowly turning toward her, the festive atmosphere evaporating in an instant. Her friends stood frozen, shock and anger flashing across their faces, but no one moved. Aaliyah swallowed, trying to make sense of the situation. "I live just a few blocks from here," she replied, her voice firm but calm. "This is my neighborhood." Blake narrowed his eyes. "Don't lie to me. You're causing a disturbance. I need to see some ID." The words felt surreal, like they belonged in someone else's nightmare, not in the middle of a community festival she had attended every year of her life. Aaliyah's hands trembled as she reached for her bag, her mind racing. She wasn't doing anything wrong. Why was this happening? Her friends watched in stunned silence, unsure how to react. "I'm not causing a disturbance," Aaliyah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm here with my friends, just like everyone else." Blake's face hardened, and without warning he reached down and grabbed her arm. Aaliyah's heart leapt into her throat as she felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around her wrists. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice," Blake said, his tone flat and devoid of any empathy. The sound of the handcuffs clicking into place echoed in Aaliyah's ears, louder than anything else around her. For a moment, everything seemed to stop: the music, the laughter, even the breeze. She could feel the weight of the cuffs biting into her skin, a cold, unyielding reminder of the power Blake held over her. The crowd around them erupted in a chorus of gasps and murmurs. Phones were raised as people began recording the scene, but no one stepped forward to help. Aaliyah's friends, their faces pale with shock, shouted at the officer. "Let her go!" Rachel cried, stepping forward, her fists clenched. "She didn't do anything." "Officer, this is insane," Nate added, his voice filled with disbelief. But Blake was unmoved. He yanked Aaliyah's wheelchair forward, ignoring her protests and the growing outrage of the crowd. Aaliyah's heart raced, fear and anger flooding her veins. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not like this. She looked up, her eyes locking with Rachel's. Her friend's face was contorted with rage and fear, her hands trembling as she recorded the scene on her phone. But there was nothing she could do. Aaliyah's voice, strong and steady just moments ago, cracked as she pleaded, "Please, I didn't do anything wrong. I have my ID right here. You don't need to do this." Blake's grip tightened on her arm. "You'll learn to behave in the right places," he muttered under his breath. The murmur of the crowd grew louder, a mixture of disbelief and outrage rippling through the people gathered. Children clung to their parents, their wide eyes watching as Aaliyah was handcuffed in front of them. Families who had been enjoying the festival moments before now stared in shock, unsure how to react. "I'm recording this," shouted a man from the crowd, his phone pointed directly at Blake. "This isn't right." Blake ignored him, continuing to pull Aaliyah toward his squad car, parked just a few feet away from the festival grounds. Each bump and uneven patch of ground made the journey even more humiliating as Aaliyah struggled to keep up with Blake's rapid pace in her wheelchair. The festival, once vibrant and full of life, had taken on an eerie stillness. The music from the stage had quieted, and the joyous laughter had faded into stunned silence. Aaliyah felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, judging her, pitying her. Her stomach churned and her hands trembled uncontrollably. "Stop it! You can't do this!" Rachel's voice rang out, but she was too far away to reach Aaliyah in time. As the scene unfolded, Robert Wilson, the police chief, stood at a distance, frozen in place. He had been on break, quietly watching the festival from behind one of the food stalls, enjoying a rare moment of calm. But the commotion had drawn his attention, and now he watched, his heart heavy with the weight of what was happening. Chief Robert Wilson's instincts flared as he saw the commotion unfold. From his vantage point near the food stalls, he couldn't yet make out the details, but the crowd's reaction, the sudden quiet followed by sharp voices, was enough to pull his attention away from his quiet moment. As he made his way through the festival-goers, his heart sank when he recognized the familiar figures. There was Officer Jacob Blake, standing over a girl he knew, Aaliyah Parker, a bright, resilient young woman who had grown up in this very neighborhood. The decorated wheelchair, now adorned with handcuffs on its occupant, was a vivid image that made his stomach churn. Robert knew Aaliyah. He'd seen her at community events, always surrounded by her friends, a regular fixture in Riverdale. Yet here she was, being dragged away in front of the entire community, and it was Officer Blake at the center of it all. Blake, who had a reputation that Robert had too often dismissed. The anger and confusion in the crowd grew with each passing second. "Let her go," someone shouted, but Blake remained indifferent, focused only on Aaliyah, as if the crowd didn't exist. Wilson's mind raced. This wasn't just about Aaliyah anymore. It wasn't just a misunderstanding at a festival. This was a moment that could define the future of Riverdale's relationship between its police force and the community. And he was the one who would have to either allow it to spiral further or step in and do something. As Aaliyah's wheelchair hit a rough patch of ground, she stumbled in her efforts to keep up with Blake's aggressive pace. The metal cuffs dug painfully into her wrists, and her fear gave way to humiliation. Every step, every tug of her wheelchair was a reminder of her powerlessness in this moment. The injustice of it made her skin crawl. "I'm not resisting," she said again, her voice trembling now with both fear and anger. "Please just let me explain." But Blake wasn't listening. He was far too used to asserting control in situations like these, and, in his mind, this was no different. To him, Aaliyah was just another face in a long line of troublemakers, no matter how innocent she looked. His mind was set, his prejudices deeply rooted. As the officer reached for the door of the squad car, Aaliyah's heart pounded harder. This couldn't be happening. She'd done nothing wrong, and yet she was being treated like a criminal in front of the entire town. She felt the cold metal of the car door against her leg as Blake maneuvered her toward the back seat, preparing to shove her in. But then something unexpected happened. Officer Blake Chief Wilson's voice cut through the rising tension like a crack of thunder. Blake froze mid-motion, his hand still gripping Aaliyah's wheelchair. The chief was making his way through the crowd, his face stern but unreadable. The crowd, sensing a shift, fell into a tense silence. Even Aaliyah, who had been on the verge of panicking, felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would stop before it went any further. Blake turned to face Wilson, his jaw clenched. "She was causing a disturbance, sir. I'm taking her in." Wilson's gaze flicked from Blake to Aaliyah, who met his eyes with a mixture of desperation and silent pleading. He could see the fear in her eyes, the disbelief that this was happening at all. The chief felt a wave of shame wash over him. This wasn't just about a single officer's action, it was about the culture that had allowed Blake to act this way in the first place. And Wilson knew deep down that he had let things go too far for too long. "She wasn't causing any disturbance," Wilson said carefully, his voice steady. "She's a member of this community, just like anyone else here. Let her go." Blake's eyes narrowed in disbelief. "With all due respect, sir, she was being uncooperative. I have the right to—" Wilson cut him off, his tone hardening. "Let her go, Officer Blake. Now." The air around them was thick with tension, the crowd holding its collective breath. For a long moment, it seemed like Blake might push back. His grip on Aaliyah's wheelchair tightened, his expression unreadable. But then, slowly, he released her, the handcuffs still biting into her wrists. He stepped back, his face tight with barely restrained anger. Aaliyah let out a shaky breath, relief flooding her body, but the cuffs still bound her, and the marks they left on her wrists stung as much as the humiliation of the past few minutes. Chief Wilson stepped forward and knelt beside her, his hands gentle as he unlocked the handcuffs and removed them. He didn't say anything at first, just met Aaliyah's eyes with a look of deep regret. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice meant only for her. Aaliyah's hands trembled as she rubbed her sore wrists, but she managed a nod. Her throat felt tight, but the sense of being freed even, if only physically, was overwhelming. The crowd, still on edge, watched the scene unfold, murmurs rippling through the people as they processed what had just happened. Phones were still recording, capturing every second of the interaction, and Aaliyah knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "We'll handle this differently," Wilson said, standing up and turning to face Blake, whose expression was unreadable but defiant. "Come with me," Wilson ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Blake, his jaw set, followed the chief toward the edge of the festival grounds, but not before shooting Aaliyah a final icy glare. As the two officers walked away, Aaliyah's friends rushed to her side. Rachel knelt down, wrapping her arms around her in a tight hug. "Are you okay? I can't believe this happened. I recorded everything. We're going to make sure everyone knows what he did." Aaliyah's mind was still spinning, but she nodded, feeling Rachel's warmth and concern start to calm the storm of emotions inside her. She was okay, but only in the physical sense. The emotional toll of what had just happened was far from over. Nate stood next to her, his face pale with anger. "That guy's always been a problem. Someone needs to do something." "I'm fine," Aaliyah said softly, though she wasn't sure if she believed it yet. The weight of what had just happened was still pressing down on her, a mixture of disbelief, shame, and rage. The festival around them slowly began to return to its normal rhythm. The music from the stage picked up again, though it seemed quieter than before, as if the joy of the day had been tarnished by what had unfolded. Families and children resumed their games and conversations, but there was an uneasiness in the air, a reminder that the safety and unity they had all taken for granted was fragile. But for Aaliyah, things would never quite go back to how they were. The image of Officer Blake, his hands on her wheelchair, the cold metal of the cuffs, the humiliation of being seen as less than all of it, would stay with her. And the videos that were now circulating on social media would ensure that everyone else in the town and beyond would see it too. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Aaliyah sat at her kitchen table, staring down at her hands. The faint red marks left by the handcuffs had faded, but the memory of that cold, humiliating bite still lingered. It had only been a few hours since the festival, but it felt like a lifetime ago. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the table, the screen lighting up with notifications, texts from friends, missed calls from family, and endless social media alerts. Her older brother David paced the kitchen, his face dark with anger. He'd come over the moment he saw the video. It had already gone viral within the community, spreading faster than she could process. Her mind was still foggy from the shock, but the world outside her home was very much awake, reacting to the injustice that had unfolded in the middle of what should have been a peaceful celebration. David's voice cut through the heavy silence. "This is insane, Aaliyah. They arrested you for what? For being black and in a wheelchair." His fists clenched as he spoke, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. Aaliyah's eyes met his, her expression weary. "I don't know," she whispered. I didn't do anything wrong." Her voice cracked slightly, and she swallowed hard, trying to push down the mix of emotions that had been threatening to overwhelm her since the moment Blake had laid his hands on her wheelchair. The fear, the anger, the humiliation, it was all too much. David stopped pacing and crouched in front of her, placing his hand over hers. His expression softened slightly, but the fire in his eyes remained. "We're going to fight this. You're not alone, okay? You have the entire community behind you. You should see what's happening online. People are furious." Aaliyah's phone buzzed again, and this time she picked it up, scrolling through the flood of notifications. David was right. Her social media accounts were blowing up. Posts from classmates, friends, Even strangers were popping up, all sharing the video of her arrest and demanding justice. Hashtags like Justice for Aaliyah and End Police Brutality were already trending in the local area, and it seemed like everyone had something to say. But not all of it was supportive. Some comments were filled with anger, laced with the kind of hatred that made Aaliyah's stomach turn. She was probably resisting, one comment read. This is what happens when you cause trouble. Others blamed her for being in a white neighborhood in the first place, as if her very presence had invited the violence. Aaliyah sighed and locked her phone, tossing it back onto the table. It's not just the community that's behind me, she said softly. There are people out there who think what happened was okay. David's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the doorbell rang. He shot a glance toward the door, his protective instincts kicking in. He'll get it. Aaliyah heard the low murmur of voices from the front door as David spoke with whoever had come. A few moments later, Rachel appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, her face pale but determined. She rushed over to Aaliyah's side, wrapping her arms around her in a fierce hug. "I'm so sorry," Rachel whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have done something. I should be." "Rachel, no," Aaliyah interrupted, pulling back slightly to look at her friend. "There was nothing you could have done. It wasn't your fault." Rachel's eyes glistened with tears as she nodded, though the guilt was still etched on her face. "I just can't believe it happened. I keep replaying it in my head, and am so mad I didn't do more." "You were there," Aaliyah said gently. "That's what matters." Rachel sniffed, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Everyone's talking about it. People are furious. They're already planning a protest, Nate, and Jessica are helping organize it. We're not going to let this go, Aaliyah." Aaliyah's heart clenched at the thought of a protest in her name. Part of her wanted to curl up and disappear, to let the world move on without her having to relive that awful moment again and again. But another part of her, the part that had been building since Officer Blake had first singled her out, knew that this was bigger than her now. What had happened at the festival wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger problem, one that her community couldn't ignore anymore. She took a deep breath, her voice steadier than she expected. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of this, but I know I have to be. If this can stop it from happening to someone else, then we need to do something." David nodded, his expression serious. "You're right. This isn't just about you anymore. We're going to make sure people hear what happened." The next morning, Aaliyah woke to find her name everywhere. Local news stations had picked up the story, and videos of her arrest were being shared across social media platforms. Overnight, the footage had gone from a local controversy to something much bigger, drawing attention from activists and news outlets across the state. Aaliyah's phone was flooded with messages of support, calls for interviews, and requests for her to speak out. But even as the outpouring of support grew, so did the backlash. Aaliyah couldn't stop herself from scrolling through the comments on various posts, seeing the hate and vitriol mixed in with the messages of solidarity. Some people were quick to defend Officer Blake's actions, claiming he was just doing his job. Others spewed outright racism, accusing her of playing the victim. It hurt. It stung in a way she hadn't expected, but it also made her resolve harden. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about standing up for all the people who had been silenced, humiliated, and oppressed by the very systems that were supposed to protect them. She was deep in thought when her phone buzzed again. It was Rachel. "We're meeting at Nate's place to finalize plans for the protest. Are you okay with us going ahead?" Rachel's voice was calm, but Aaliyah could hear the underlying anxiety. She knew Rachel was trying to make sure she wasn't overwhelmed by everything that was happening so fast. Aaliyah hesitated for a moment before responding. "Yeah, let's do it. I want to be involved. I need to be." An hour later, she was sitting in Nate's living room, surrounded by her closest friends. Nate had his laptop open, showing them the flyers and social media posts he'd already started drafting for the protest. "The plan is to hold it outside the police station," Nate explained, his fingers tapping rapidly against the keyboard. "We're calling for Officer Blake to be fired, and for the department to undergo mandatory bias training." Rachel nodded. "We've already had dozens of people reach out saying they'll be there." This is going to be huge, Aaliyah. Jessica, who had been quiet until now, looked over at Aaliyah with a serious expression. Are you sure you're ready for this? It's going to get big. Like, really big. Aaliyah took a deep breath. I'm ready. The words felt true, even if part of her still felt terrified. This wasn't just about getting justice for herself, it was about exposing the deeply rooted racism that allowed officers like Blake to act without consequence. It was about the people who had been silenced before her, whose voices had been ignored or dismissed. Rachel reached over and squeezed Aaliyah's hand. We're with you, every step of the way. As the protest date approached, the buzz around Aaliyah's story continued to grow. Local news stations ran stories on the upcoming demonstration, and interviews with community leaders started popping up on television and online. Aaliyah even received a call from a local civil rights organization offering their support. On the day of the protest, the streets around Riverdale were filled with people, some carrying signs that read, "Justice for Aaliyah" and "End Racial Profiling," while others simply showed up to stand in solidarity. The atmosphere was charged, but there was a sense of hope among the crowd, a collective understanding that this was a moment of reckoning. Aaliyah stood at the front of the crowd, her heart pounding in her chest, as she looked out over the sea of faces. There were so many people, so many who believed in her, in this movement. She saw her parents, her brother, and her friends standing beside her, offering their silent but powerful support. When it was her turn to speak, she rolled her wheelchair up to the makeshift podium that had been set up outside the police station. The crowd quieted, their attention focused entirely on her. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the microphone, but when she began to speak, her voice was clear and strong. I stand here today because I was given no choice, Aaliyah began, her voice steady despite the emotion rising in her chest. I was humiliated and treated like a criminal for doing nothing but existing in my own community. But this isn't just about me. This is about every person who has ever been targeted because of the color of their skin, their disability, or who they are. The crowd erupted in applause, and Aaliyah paused, letting the sound wash over her. She took a deep breath and continued. This isn't just about one bad officer. This is about a system that allows people like him to act with impunity, to believe that they can treat people like us without consequence. That has to end. We are demanding justice, not just for me, but for everyone who has been wronged by this system. The crowd's cheers grew louder, the energy building as Aaliyah spoke. Her fear melted away, replaced by a sense of empowerment she hadn't known was possible. While Aaliyah's protest gained momentum, Chief Robert Wilson sat in his office, staring blankly at the news coverage on the television. The footage of Aaliyah speaking in front of the police station played on the screen, her voice filled with passion and righteous anger. Wilson's stomach churned. He knew, deep down, that what had happened to Aaliyah was wrong. He had known it the moment he saw Officer Blake dragging her toward the squad car. But it was more than that. It was a symptom of a much larger problem that he had been too blind or too complicit to address for too long. Had received calls from members of the department, some defending Blake's actions, others quietly expressing concern. His officers were divided, and Wilson felt the weight of that division pressing down on him. He was torn. On one hand, he felt a responsibility to stand by his officers, to protect the integrity of his department. But on the other hand, he couldn't ignore the clear injustice that had taken place. The longer he hesitated, the more complicit he became in the very system he had once sworn to reform. Wilson turned off the television and stood, pacing the small space of his office. His mind raced with the implications of his next move. Could he really take a stand against one of his own? What would it mean for his career? For the department's future? But the image of Aaliyah, her wrists bruised from the handcuffs, flashed in his mind, and he knew what he had to do. Aaliyah sat in the back seat of David's car, staring out at the streets of Riverdale. The entire town had come alive with something she hadn't expected: solidarity. As they approached the center of town, where the police station stood, Aaliyah saw people gathering in the streets. They carried signs high above their heads, signs that read, "Justice for Aaliyah," End racial profiling, and we won't be silent. She could hear the hum of the crowd, a low buzz of anticipation, as people gathered for the protest that her friends and community had organized in her name. David parked the car and glanced over at her. "You ready?" he asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. Aaliyah didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure how to put into words the mix of emotions swirling inside her. There was fear of what could happen, of what this might mean for her and her family. But there was also determination. A part of her knew that this moment was bigger than her fear. It was about something much larger, something that needed to be confronted head-on. "I'm ready," she said softly, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. David nodded and got out of the car, coming around to help her with her wheelchair. As he locked it in place, Aaliyah took a deep breath and tried to steady her nerves. The crowd was much bigger than she'd imagined. Hundreds of people had shown up, not just from Riverdale, but from neighboring towns as well. The energy in the air was electric, a mix of righteous anger and hope. Rachel, Nate, and Jessica were already there, standing near the front of the gathering. Rachel spotted Aaliyah and waved her over with a big smile, though Aaliyah could see the tension in her friend's eyes. This was a big deal not just for Aaliyah but for everyone. As David pushed her through the crowd, Aaliyah noticed familiar faces, people from her school, neighbors, and even people she didn't know, all standing together. Some held up their phones, live streaming the protest to social media. Others simply stood in silence, their faces set with determination. When she reached the front of the crowd, Aaliyah saw a small podium had been set up. A microphone rested on top, waiting for her. Her heart skipped a beat, but she knew there was no turning back now. This was her moment to speak, to be the voice that so many others needed to hear. As she made her way up to the podium, a hush fell over the crowd. All eyes were on her, and the weight of that attention pressed down on her shoulders. For a moment, Aaliyah felt her breath catch in her throat, but then she looked out over the sea of face. Her friends, her family, her community. They weren't just watching her, they were standing with her. That knowledge gave her the strength to push past the fear. She adjusted the microphone, her hands trembling slightly as she leaned forward. The silence was heavy, but she welcomed it. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she began to speak. "I was just a girl at a festival," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "I wasn't breaking any laws, I wasn't causing any trouble. I was just trying to enjoy my day like everyone else." A murmur ran through the crowd, a ripple of agreement. "But that didn't matter to Officer Blake," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "To him I was a threat. Not because of what I did, but because of what I am. Because I'm black. Because I'm disabled. Because in his eyes, I didn't belong." The crowd was silent, listening intently as Aaliyah's words struck a chord with them. She could feel the emotions swirling around her, the anger and frustration that had been building for days. "I'm not just here to tell you what happened to me," she said, her voice rising. "I'm here because this isn't just about me. This is about every person who has ever been stopped, questioned, or harassed because of how they look. This is about a system that allows people like Officer Blake to act without consequence." The crowd erupted in applause, cheers filling the air as Aaliyah's words hit home. She took a deep breath, letting the energy of the crowd wash over her. "This is about justice," Aaliyah continued, her voice strong and unwavering. "Not just for me, but for every person who has been treated like they don't matter. We matter. Our voices matter. And we will not be silent anymore." The cheers grew louder, a roar of approval that echoed through the streets. Aaliyah felt her heart swell with pride and determination. She was no longer afraid. She was part of something bigger than herself, something that had the power to change the world. As Aaliyah's voice echoed through the crowd, Chief Robert Wilson stood inside the police station, watching from a window. The muffled sound of the crowd's cheers reached him even through the thick glass, and he could see the mass of people gathered outside. They held signs, chanted slogans, and demanded justice not just for Aaliyah, but for the countless others who had suffered at the hands of an unjust system. Wilson's hands rested on the windowsill, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge. He had watched Aaliyah's speech from inside, and every word had hit him like a punch to the gut. She was right. This wasn't just about one officer, one mistake. This was about the entire Sistema system that he had been a part of for far too long. He sighed, his breath fogging up the glass in front of him. He had spent his entire career trying to balance the demands of the job with the needs of the community. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of what really mattered. He had allowed officers like Blake to go unchecked, believing that their aggressive tactics were necessary to maintain order. Now he could see how wrong he had been. Wilson turned away from the window and made his way to his desk. His mind was racing, torn between the loyalty he felt toward his officers and the growing realization that he could no longer stand by and do nothing. He had to take a stand no matter the consequences. He picked up the phone and dialed the number he had been avoiding for days. "Mayor Johnson," he said when the line connected. "We need to talk." The next day, Chief Wilson stood at a podium of his own, facing a room full of reporters and news cameras. The protest had drawn even more attention than he had expected, and the pressure on him to act had reached its peak. Alia's voice, and the voices of the hundreds who stood with her, could no longer be ignored. He cleared his throat, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment of reckoning. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. "I stand here today to address the events that have taken place in our community. Over the past several days, we have seen the pain and frustration of our citizens, and it is clear that changes need to be made." He paused, glancing out at the sea of faces in front of him. He knew that many of the officers in his department would be watching this as well. They would not be happy with what he was about to say, but it didn't matter. This was the right thing to do. Effective immediately, Officer Jacob Blake has been placed on suspension pending a full investigation into his conduct, Wilson continued. "Additionally, I will be launching a comprehensive review of our department's practices, with a focus on addressing the concerns of racial bias and ensuring accountability for all officers." The room buzzed with the sounds of reporters scribbling notes and snapping photos, but Wilson didn't flinch. He pressed on, determined to make his message clear. "We will be implementing mandatory bias training for all officers," he announced, "and we will be working closely with community leaders to ensure that the people of this town are heard and respected. This is just the beginning of a long road to rebuilding trust, but I am committed to making that journey." Wilson took a deep breath as he finished his statement. The room erupted in a flurry of questions, reporters shouting over one another in an attempt to get his attention. But Wilson didn't answer any of them. He simply stepped away from the podium, knowing that his words would speak for themselves. As he left the room, he felt the weight of his decision settle on his shoulders. He had taken the first step toward justice, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be backlash from his officers, from certain members of the community, but he was ready for it. Because, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right side of history. Alia sat on her bed scrolling through her phone. The messages of support were overwhelming. Thousands of people had shared her speech, and her social media accounts had blown up overnight. Activists from across the country had reached out to her, offering their help and advice. She had even been contacted by several news outlets, asking for interviews. But along with the support came the darker side of fame. Alia had received threats, anonymous messages telling her to stop, to stay quiet, or else. Some were filled with vitriol, others were more veiled, but they all carried the same underlying message that she was pushing too hard, that she was making people uncomfortable. She tried to brush it off, but it wasn't easy. The fear gnawed at her, even as she pushed forward with the movement. Every time she opened her phone, there was another message reminding her that not everyone wanted to see change. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text from Rachel. "You okay?" Alia smiled slightly. Rachel had been checking in constantly, making sure Alia wasn't feeling too overwhelmed by everything. She appreciated it more than she could say. "Yeah, just tired." "But I'm okay," Alia replied. She set her phone down and leaned back against the pillows. The movement was growing bigger than she had ever imagined it could be. But with that growth came new challenges, new fears. She wasn't just a girl at a festival anymore. She was a symbol, a voice for justice, and that was a lot to carry. But as she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, Aaliyah reminded herself of why she was doing this. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been wronged, silenced, or overlooked. And she wasn't going to let fear stop her from fighting for them. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting a golden glow over Riverdale Park. The same park where Aaliyah had been wrongfully arrested now buzzed with the anticipation of something much bigger. The air was thick with energy as people gathered once again, not just for a protest, but for a massive rally, a celebration of unity and justice. A stage had been set up near the center of the park, and the surrounding trees were adorned with banners that read, "Equality now, justice for all, and we stand with Aaliyah." Aaliyah could feel the buzz of the crowd as she made her way to the stage. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of nerves and excitement running through her veins. The past few weeks had been overwhelming. Interviews with the media, meetings with activists, and the constant flood of messages from supporters. But through it all, she had felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. David pushed her wheelchair through the throngs of people who had come to support her, many of whom called out words of encouragement as she passed. "We're with you," Aaliyah shouted, a woman holding a sign that read, "Stand up for justice." Aaliyah smiled at her, giving a small wave as she passed. Her heart swelled at the sight of so many people, from all walks of life, coming together for the same cause. As they reached the stage, Aaliyah took a deep breath, preparing herself for what was about to happen. She had spoken at protests and meetings, but this felt different. The crowd was larger than ever, with people gathered from all over the state, and she knew that the stakes were higher now. This rally wasn't just about her, it was about something much bigger, the fight for justice and equality. Rachel was already on stage, organizing the event with Nate, Jessica, and other volunteers. She smiled when she saw Aaliyah approaching, giving her a thumbs up. "You ready for this?" Rachel asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement and pride. Aaliyah nodded, though her stomach was a knot of nerves. "Yeah, let's do this." The crowd quieted as Aaliyah took her place at the podium. She looked out at the sea of facesso. Many people had come to support her, to hear her story. For a moment, the weight of it all felt overwhelming, but then she remembered why she was here. This was her fight, her moment to make a difference. She couldn't back down now. As she leaned into the microphone, her voice was clear and strong. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her eyes scanning the crowd. "It means more than I can say, not just to me, but to everyone who has been affected by the same injustice I faced. We're here today because we believe in something bigger than ourselves. We believe in justice. We believe in equality. And we believe that it's time for change." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Aaliyah felt the energy surging through her. She continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "What happened to me could have happened to anyone. It wasn't just about one bad officer. It's about a system that allows people like Officer Blake to act with impunity, to believe that they can treat people like me, like us, without consequence. But we are here to say that those days are over. We will not be silent. We will not back down. We are demanding justice, and we will keep fighting until we get it." The crowd's cheers grew louder, filling the park with their collective power. Aaliyah could feel the support, the determination, the hope that had brought all these people together. It was a beautiful, overwhelming moment, and for the first time in a long time, Aaliyah felt like real change was within reach. But then, just as the rally seemed to reach its emotional peak, something shifted. A commotion stirred at the back of the crowd, and Aaliyah could see a group of people protesters from the opposing side beginning to make their way toward the stage. They carried their own signs, scrawled with hateful messages that made Aaliyah's stomach turn. "No more protests," one read. "Stop playing victim." Another sign displayed a racial slur that made Aaliyah's heart clench with anger. The crowd around them began to tense, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Rachel, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward to speak, but before she could, the group of counter-protesters pushed their way closer to the front. One of them, a tall man wearing a baseball cap, shouted out, his voice filled with anger. "Enough of this nonsense. You people need to stop stirring up trouble." The atmosphere changed in an instant. Tension crackled in the air, and Aaliyah could feel the shift in the crowd. People began to move uneasily, voices rising in response to the intrusion. A few shouts echoed back from the crowd, and Aaliyah's pulse quickened. She could feel the fragile balance tipping toward chaos. "Stay calm," David whispered to her from behind, but she could see the worry in his eyes. Rachel, sensing the rising danger, stepped forward and grabbed the microphone. "This is a peaceful rally," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the growing noise. "We're here to stand up for justice, not to fight. Let's keep it that way." But the group of counter-protesters wasn't backing down. They pushed closer to the stage, their shouts growing louder. "You're dividing this town," one man yelled, his face twisted with anger. "Go back to where you belong." The insult hit Aaliyah like a slap in the face, but she didn't flinch. She had been expecting something like this, though it didn't make it any easier to face. The fear she had been trying to suppress started to bubble to the surface, but she forced herself to stay calm. She wasn't going to let them win. Not today. As the tension mounted, Aaliyah knew she had to do something. The crowd was on edge, and she could see people starting to get restless, their emotions flaring. If things escalated any further, this could turn into something much worse. With a deep breath, Aaliyah rolled herself forward, positioning her wheelchair right in front of the podium. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, the crowd waiting for her next move. She reached out and took the microphone from Rachel, who gave her a nod of encouragement. "Enough," Aaliyah's voice rang out, clear and commanding. The crowd fell silent. "This is not what we're here for," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We're not here to fight. We're here to stand up for what's right. We're here to demand justice. But we won't do it with violence or hatred. That's not who we are." She looked directly at the group of counter-protesters, meeting their angry gazes without flinching. "You have every right to disagree with us," Aaliyah said, her voice steady. "But we will not be silenced. We will not be intimidated. We're standing up for justice, and we're doing it peacefully. We're not going anywhere." For a long moment, the air was thick with tension. The counter-protesters stood frozen, as if unsure how to respond. The crowd waited, holding its collective breath. And then, slowly, the man in the baseball cap backed away, muttering under his breath as he and his group retreated into the back of the crowd. The relief that swept through the rally was palpable. The tension that had been building finally began to dissipate, and the crowd erupted in applause, their cheers louder than ever before. Aaliyah felt a wave of emotion wash over her: relief, pride, and something deeper, something that felt like hope. She had done it. She had faced her fear, and she had stood up for what she believed in. And the crowd, her community, had stood with her. As the rally wound down and people began to disperse, Aaliyah felt a deep sense of exhaustion settling into her bones. But it wasn't the kind of exhaustion that came from defeat, was the kind that came from knowing that you had given everything you had to something that mattered. David wheeled her away from the stage as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. People were still lingering, talking amongst themselves, and sharing stories of what they had just witnessed. The atmosphere was one of cautious optimism. Change was coming, but it would take time. Rachel caught up with them, her face flushed from the excitement and the adrenaline of the day. "You were amazing," she said breathlessly, giving Aaliyah a wide grin. "Seriously, I've never seen anything like it." Aaliyah smiled, though she felt too drained to fully process everything that had happened. "It wasn't just me," she said quietly. "It was all of us." Rachel nodded, her eyes softening. "Yeah, but you're the one who made it happen. You're the reason we're all here." Aaliyah didn't know what to say to that. She had never set out to become a symbol or a leader, but that was exactly what she had become. And now, as the dust settled, she realized that she had a responsibility to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had stood beside her. Months later, Aaliyah found herself back at Riverdale Park, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. The annual festival had returned, and the park was filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and joy. Families gathered on picnic blankets, children raced through the grass, and the sweet smell of funnel cakes filled the air. But something was different this year. The park itself felt changed, as if the events of the past few months had left an indelible mark on the community. People smiled at Aliyah as she passed, some nodding in recognition, others offering words of thanks. The park had become a symbol not just of what had happened to Aliyah, but of the resilience and strength of the people who had come together to demand change. As Aliyah rolled through the park, her friends by her side, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It had been a long, difficult journey, and there were still challenges ahead, but they had come so far. The police department had implemented the reforms that Chief Wilson had promised, and Officer Blake had been held accountable for his actions. The system wasn't perfect, but it was changing slowly but surely. A small stage had been set up near the center of the park, and as Aliyah approached, she saw a group of children gathered there, getting ready to perform. One of the organizers spotted her and waved her over with a big smile. "We have something for you," the woman said, her eyes twinkling. Aliyah raised an eyebrow, curious. "For me?" The woman nodded and gestured toward the stage. "We wanted to honor you for everything you've done for this community. You're the reason we're here today." Aliyah's heart swelled with emotion as she rolled up to the stage. The crowd, sensing what was happening, began to gather around, their eyes filled with admiration and gratitude. The organizer handed her a microphone, and Aliyah took it, her hands shaking slightly as she brought it to her lips. "I don't know what to say," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "Except thank you. Thank you for standing with me, for fighting with me. This isn't just my fight, it's ours. And together, we've made something beautiful." The crowd erupted in applause, and Aliyah smiled, her heart full. As the children on the stage began their performance, she looked out over the sea of faces and realized that this was what it was all about: community, unity, and the power of standing up for what's right. As the performance went on, colorful balloons were handed out to everyone in the crowd. When the moment came, the crowd released the balloons into the sky, their vibrant colors filling the air as they drifted higher and higher. Aliyah watched as the balloons floated away, a symbol of hope and the promise of a brighter future. The journey wasn't over, but they had come so far, and with the strength of her community behind her, Aliyah knew they would keep moving forward together. The park, once a place of pain and humiliation, had become a symbol of resilience and hope. It was a testament to the power of standing together, of refusing to be silenced. And as Aliyah looked around at the smiling faces, the children playing, and the families gathered in peace, she knew that they had built something new, something better. It wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Thank you for joining Aliyah's powerful journey of resilience and justice. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more content like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories and thought-provoking discussions. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support helps us continue to share important stories that matter. Let's keep the conversation going and stand together for positive change. "I thought we were better than this." Jonathan nodded. "Most people do, until they take a closer look." To his credit, Tom didn't shy away from the truth. He immediately committed to making changes, starting with mandatory diversity training for all of his employees. He also introduced new policies to ensure that seating and service were based solely on fairness, with no room for bias. Over time, the chain's reputation improved, and Tom publicly acknowledged the positive impact Jonathan's work had on his business. As Jonathan and his team continued to expand their work, they also began focusing on education. They realized that to create lasting change, they needed to reach the next generation of leaders. Jonathan started partnering with universities and business schools, offering seminars and guest lectures on the importance of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. At one such seminar, Jonathan spoke to a group of young business students at Northwestern University. He shared his story, how he had gone undercover in his own stores and discovered the racial biases that had been hidden in plain sight. He explained how the experience had transformed his business and made him a better leader. The students listened in rapt attention. Many of them had grown up in diverse communities, but even they were surprised by the depth of the issues Jonathan described. After his talk, Several students approached him with questions, eager to learn more about how they could make a difference in their future careers. One student, Alyssa Martinez, was particularly moved. "I want to start my own business one day," she told Jonathan. "And I want to make sure it's a place where everyone feels welcome." "How do I make sure I don't miss the things you missed at first?" Jonathan smiled, appreciating the honesty in her question. "It starts with awareness," he said. "You have to be willing to ask the hard questions, to look for the problems even when they're not obvious. And you have to create a culture where everyone on your team feels responsible for doing the same." Alyssa nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "I'll do that," she said. "Thank you." Moments like this reminded Jonathan of why he had started this journey in the first place. It wasn't just about changing one company or even one city, it was about planting the seeds of change that would grow for generations to come. Years later, as Jonathan sat in his office, looking out over the city he loved, he reflected on the incredible journey he and his team had taken. What had started as a single undercover mission to uncover the truth in his own stores had blossomed into a national movement for change. Businesses all over the country had implemented new policies, rewritten customer service guidelines, and committed to creating more inclusive environments. Jonathan knew that the fight against racism and discrimination wasn't something that could be won in a matter of months or even years. It was an ongoing battle, one that required constant vigilance and dedication. But he also knew that real progress had been made. The seeds of change they had planted had taken root, and the impact was undeniable. As he glanced at the framed newspaper articles on his wall stories, detailing how refined elegance had become a symbol of progress, how his team had helped transform other businesses, Jonathan felt a deep sense of pride. His company had become more than just a place for luxury shopping. It had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of empathy, understanding, and the willingness to confront hard truths. That evening, Jonathan gathered his team for their final meeting of the year. The room was filled with familiar faces, employees who had been with him since the beginning of this journey, as well as new advocates who had joined along the way. There was a sense of accomplishment in the air, but also a recognition that the work was far from finished. "We've done a lot of good," Jonathan said, his voice filled with emotion. "But we can't stop now. There are still businesses out there that need our help, still communities where people are being treated unfairly. We have to keep going." The team nodded in agreement, their faces filled with determination. They had come so far, but they knew the journey wasn't over. Together, they would continue to push for change, one step at a time. As the meeting ended and his team filed out of the room, Jonathan lingered for a moment, taking it all in. The fight for equality was a long one, but it was a fight worth having. And as long as there were people willing to stand up, to ask hard questions, and to push for progress, there was always hope for a better future. Months later, Jonathan received a letter from Alyssa Martinez, the business student he had spoken to at Northwestern. She had started her own small business, a clothing boutique in her hometown, and was determined to ensure it was an inclusive, welcoming space for everyone. "I just wanted to thank you," Alyssa wrote. "Your story inspired me to build my business the right way from the start. I've been following your example, making sure that every person who walks through my doors feels respected and valued. And I'm going to keep pushing for that, no matter what." Jonathan smiled as he read the letter, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The ripple effect was real, and it was growing stronger with each new advocate for change. He knew that there would always be challenges ahead. But for now, he was content knowing that the seeds of hope, empathy, and equality had taken root, and that they would continue to grow for generations to come. If you enjoy this story of transformation, empathy, and the fight for equality, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We bring you more stories just like this, stories that inspire, challenge, and push for positive change in the world. Don't forget to like, share, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Together we can make a difference, one story at a time.